And now, your feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled movie review. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rorabeck. Alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchen.
Hey Matt, how are you?
I'm good, man. How about you?
I'm good. This is a review for a film that is now available to stream on Netflix. But as you can tell by Matt's shirt, if you're watching this on YouTube, and if you've been following Untitled Movie Podcast or our reviews, we've talked about it a lot recently. TIFF is coming up, so we're kind of in TIFF mode for the most part, and so having been prepping for that, we might seem a little bit more absent-minded or not as focused on releases that are coming up between now, which is, as we're recording this, September 3rd and the 10th, per se, and even the 17th to a lesser extent.
Yes, today we are reviewing Sara Colangelo's Worth, which, is Eric just mentioned, now streaming on Netflix, for the 20th anniversary of the attacks on the Twin Towers, 9/11. So I think
I just want to interrupt you there for a second, because you just mentioning that the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And before we get into the review, there are moments in history and life where you remember where you were when it happened, or you have a stronger sense of that moment in time. Like, you think, our parents' generation, they remember when when they were kids and Kennedy was assassinated, and they heard on the news that was happening. So I wanted to ask you,
like a big worldwide event that everyone kind of pays attention to. I know these are very American focused that we're talking about. I think we're living through one right now.
But this isn't, though. This is 9/11. Yes, it took place on American soil in New York, and it was a tragedy for the nation, but it felt international in terms of
totally
the world changing. So I wanted to ask you, before we even started, where were you when it happened, and what were you doing, and what were your thoughts?
Yeah, so to start, like, it's always interesting because you talked about, like, we're focused on TIFF and things like that. So, the movies that are coming out, today on the 3rd and next week on the 10th, we're kind of trying to squeeze in here and get them done, or maybe we'll get reviews after the festival. And 9/11, obviously I'll get into where I think I remember I was in 2001, very young. I was 12 years old at the time. But TIFF and 9/11, I mean, TIFF is at the beginning of September every year, right? So, like, that's kind of always one of those things where it's hard to, it always happens when we're in the middle of the festival seeing a bunch of movies, and there's always either sometimes a moment of silence or something like that people do if you're seeing films on that day. So I always kind of, TIFF is always at the beginning of September, and then, the anniversary of kind of remembering, unfortunately, the people we lost that day, and just you said the world changing, and just that day, especially, and TIFF just kind of go weirdly in the same place in my brain because they always happen at the same time. But in 2001, yeah, I would have been 12. So I would have been, what, grade 7, I think.
Yes.
And you would have been grade 8, you
Yeah.
think? Like, yeah. And then I remember, because I lived so close to my school, I think I did go to school, or what time did it happen? Like 8 in the morning, right? Didn't it? Or like 7:30, 8 in the morning. Like, it was pretty early, right?
And it was throughout the day as well, because the first tower fell, and then it took time for the second tower to fall, right? And so that morning into the afternoon,
I remember coming home from school. I think they sent everyone home. Or,
see, that's interesting, because they didn't.
I don't know. Or I was
at my school.
Or I remember everyone talking. I was so close to home. Like, I lived. I was not very punctual as a kid because, and especially in school, I lived so close I could hear the school bell from my house. So, like, that would almost be my alarm every morning. And I was that kid who lived the closest to the school but was the latest to school every day. And from what I remember, I either at recess or maybe I was at school, and things started to trickle out. But I think we were young enough that they didn't want to, like, scare everyone. So I don't remember exactly. I just remember being at recess and kids talking and thinking that we were going to war or something like in like the US, and I don't know how Canada would be involved in things like that, and being pretty young and not totally understanding it. But then I remember going home maybe for lunch. That's what I remember, because I would go home for lunch every day. And then maybe I stayed home the rest of the day after lunch, because I don't know if they sent everyone home, but I think maybe I went home for lunch, and I remember watching it on the news with like my parents being home or whatever. And then maybe staying home that day. But I don't have like a really, like, I have a bad memory in general, sometimes, for things, but I don't necessarily remember if I stayed home or what happened the next couple days. But that day, I remember the day at school a little bit, and I remember watching the news at home, and that's kind of all I can kind of remember. What about you?
Yeah, so I remember grade 8. It was the morning that it was, everything was as a typical day.
Mm-hmm.
I was in music class, and
Right.
this is also a time, like, to people that are listening that might be younger listeners or watchers on YouTube. This is a time when social media wasn't prevalent, like it
Right.
wasn't, like I
We had
feel
the
like.
internet, but we didn't have cell phones or anything like that.
Exactly. Like,
And
I feel like if an event like this happened now, there would be no way for teachers or an administration
to
staff
shield
to.
the children from it.
Exactly. And so there were kind of like whispers about it throughout the morning that maybe, like, other kids overheard something strange going on in the US and what have you. And then after lunch, as you mentioned, kids coming back, they didn't cancel the rest of the day. They kept the school going and the classes going, and teachers were there. But after lunch, a lot of kids were coming back, and they were telling other kids what was going
What
on.
happened? Yeah, that might have been the same case for me. I'm not sure.
And just thinking about how kids interpret the news at, when you're at a younger age, and when you're thinking about it, it almost felt like it was the end of the world. Like, it felt like the
Hmm.
world was like, we were going into World War III, and it almost
Yeah.
felt like the world was ending, and
Because
it
at
was
first you
so
thought it was an
scary.
accident, right? Like, I
Yeah.
think everyone did, until that second one hit. And then I think people started to obviously realize what was happening. And then as kids, maybe you couldn't fully grasp that. But if your parents telling you like, no, we were attacked, or not, the US was attacked. But yeah, I kind of with you, where your senses are heightened, or everything is heightened when you're younger. And I remember feeling kind of of a similar way.
Because the thing I remember the most was the day after,
Hmm.
where they brought in counselors
Hmm.
to talk to all the students, and they brought in the newspapers from the next day. Like,
Yeah.
the one that I always remember the most, even though it's a terrible newspaper, is the Toronto Star. And for people that don't know, the Toronto Star is a very conservative newspaper
I thought the
that's.
sun
or
is, the
or
star
yeah,
isn't.
the Sun.
Yeah,
Pardon me.
yeah, yeah.
The
The star
Sun.
is okay, but the
Star is fine.
Toronto Sun
Sun,
is
yes, but the
garbage.
Toronto
Yeah.
Sun, their headline with the image of one of the planes crashing into the tower was "bastards" with an exclamation
Yeah,
mark,
I do
and
remember
that
that.
was.
Yeah.
I was like,
Provocative,
yeah,
right?
and
Because,
and
like,
and again,
yeah.
like, thinking it's the Toronto Sun, it is what it is. But, like, at that moment, it's like, wow, I've never seen, a newspaper use an exploitative,
Yeah. On the
and
headline on the
yeah,
front
and like
page.
that,
Yeah.
and just again thinking, like, what is the world going to be like, and asking, you know parents and counselors and teachers, and just there was no certainty of what was going to happen next, and just thinking,
Hmm.
like, how scary that was.
Yeah, and I mean, well, and I think this all is a good conversation leading into this movie, and I just think it's wild, how I don't want to get too political and things like that too, but the time we're living with now with the coronavirus pandemic, and how many people we have lost, in the US and worldwide, like, compared to an event like this was a horrible thing. And I think because it was an attack, and it was dramatic with planes crashing into a building, and, someone targeting specifically the United States, that, we've remembered this for 20 years, and it's been this big event. And it's just wild to me that we still have, you see right now, anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers and stuff like that, and just not treating this fucking pandemic with respect and not respecting the people who have died during this pandemic that have, totaled, like look at we lost thousands of people during this attack. Horribly sad. We'll get into it. They cover that in this movie. But it was just wild to me, even as we were going through this, that, the same people who are probably thinking about 9/11 and then going through coronavirus right now and not treating, I don't know, all the people who died during these past year and a half, 2 years, that with respect to, it's just wild to me that, like, people can think it's a hoax. And I mean, people have thought that there's been shit about 9/11, about all that stuff too, but I don't know, it just puts things in perspective, because I remember, even watching it and all that stuff coming back. And I think we are living through one of those times, Eric, that, it's extended because it's been 2 years, but this is an event, I don't want to take the attention away from this movie or the 20th anniversary of 9/11, but it's just, I think watching it and then not thinking about it that much, 9/11, like, because it happened a while ago, you kind of start to forget.
Well,
And
the
then
years,
this
the
movie, yeah,
like that saying, time heals all wounds, but it also is
yeah,
something that kind of, the more you get away from it, the less pain it
yeah,
is there. But again, it never goes away either, because it's
hmm,
still something that is so impactful in terms of how it changed the way we look at
yeah,
history and life and politics, and
hmm,
that gets into this film as well, because it's looking at the legality of the situation in a very early post 9/11, like a couple of days after, where you have, you know Kenneth Feinberg, who's a Washington counselor, a New York lawyer who now works in New York, taking the reins on this September 11th victims fund, and sort of the
hmm,
compensation for those who lost their lives, which would go to, the money would go to their family, or those who were severely injured. And the idea behind this is that it will cover, everybody that was either, first responders or in the building at the time. And they have to look at it because they have a baseline, and it's almost like, okay, well, is a maintenance worker the same as somebody that
worth
is,
the same
yeah,
as, yeah.
exactly. And that's the whole point of this movie. And Michael Keaton, who plays Kenneth Feinberg, I think is always good. And here, like, the way that he handles the
Agreed.
dialogue, and sort of looking at it from a very pragmatic point of view, and being impartial, and talking about being objective, even though it's almost impossible once you start getting
Meeting
into
the
the
families and,
meetings and the
yeah,
interviews that are conducted. Um, but there's also that kind of behind the scenes of, like, the US government wants this to go away as soon as possible, so they're given a deadline of basically 2 years.
to get
um
80% of people to buy into this instead of suing separately. Because
yes.
for what I grasped, if everyone sued separately, it could bankrupt all the airlines, which then would crash the economy. And there's a bunch of different things that could have happened that
Which would result
if,
in another depression,
yeah,
and also especially thinking, like, okay, as this movie is unfolding in real time, um like, there's this idea that, okay, well, they're going to war, the US is going to go to war, and so that also will affect the economy greatly. But again, like, this is coming from the point of view of looking at how politics and business are basically not a good mix for the moral stance in which you need to approach um a fun like this. and
and I
and
think, dude, going back to what's happening right now, which is why I think, people are going, why the hell don't we just shut down for 3 months? Or why haven't we shut down just to, like, putting lives in before, the economy or businesses and things like that. And I think it's kind of exactly what's happening right now in a very different way, but it's just all kind of living through this. Just, I don't think I maybe would have had the same perspective. I think is what I mean when I'm watching and listening this and seeing what's happening now and going, well, why are we still open? Or why are we doing this? And now we're introducing vaccine passports or different things like that. Or why have businesses been open when cases keep going up and things like that? And I think that conversation in the boardroom that they talk about, of being like, we need people, we'll give billions of dollars to this fund to pay people, but we can't have them all. I don't necessarily agree with it. But they're like, if everyone's sued, it would just crash the economy. And then, that is the worst thing that can happen, because then, society starts to crumble.
Well, not only that, and this is also a key point in the film, is that if, they decide to go with a class action lawsuit, it takes much longer, and some
Yes.
people need the money as soon as possible because, they're a single parent now and they're struggling to, pay the bills. And so you have to look at the situation like that. It's so complex,
It's very complex,
and almost impossible to take on something so unspeakable in terms of the emotional toll, and you see it again mostly from the point of view of Kenneth Feinberg and his legal team. Amy Ryan is his business partner in this, and there's a moment that she has after interviewing one of the victims' family members, and in any other movie, I think it's still manipulative to a certain extent, but I think the way it's handled and where it's like, how do you decompress, or how do you put that away? And especially if you're doing multiple interviews with people who have lost somebody, and, telling them telling this lawyer the story, because it helps with, the idea of how much they're going to make. And part of it in terms of the finances is looked at like how much they were making,
their salaries.
in
And
a
it's a
month.
formula they come up with, essentially, which just is supposed to be this kind of, here's a formula. If you made this much and you had this many, your mortgage versus how many people, kids and dependents and all this kind of stuff, just made up this baseline number of like, here's your worth as a human being. And I guess that's the moral question the movie is kind of going through, and having Kenneth Feinberg go through as he's doing this kind of pro bono case for the government, trying to, and ultimately he has good intentions. It's just that, like you said, it's almost an impossible job to, appease, basically. I like the juxtaposition between that one sequence where they show, and again, it is a little manipulative and on the nose and things like that, but I feel like it's kind of okay in a movie like this, where I don't think it's so heavy handed, but I like that conversation, the two conversations happening with, like, the CEOs and their lawyers and stuff like that. And then you go to the kitchen workers and the janitors and stuff and their families.
Many of which are undocumented as well, because that's
Yeah.
a key point in that moment.
And they're grateful for the, $250,000 they're going to get, where the CEOs and their lawyers, it's not their families, like the lower people too, are saying, 14 million's not enough to blah, blah. And I thought that
wasn't it 200,000?
for the families,
Yeah.
the young, sure. Sorry, I said 250, but I just mean like a much lower number, and they were just grateful that they would even get any money to help go. And then the greediness of, not necessarily greediness, but like, I like that juxtaposition between, the 1% and the everyday kind of workers down at the lower levels of the building too, and even that kind of metaphor.
See, that's the thing where I was kind of mixed on, but I get what you're saying, where like, I think again, those are scenes where it's intentional, and
sure, it's driving the point
the
home,
script, Max Bornstein's script is self-aware in that way, that it knows what it's doing when it's sort of emotionally
I didn't think it was so heavy-handed or so manipulative, but
it still is there. Like,
there.
I mean, it's obvious enough to see, again, as you mentioned, the juxtaposition through the editing, even in terms of cutting back and forth between the litigation.
No, and they even have a conversation
Ryan
after. They kind of hammer it home.
Yeah, doing the sort of, she's going through a translator to talk to, these mostly
don't get me wrong,
Latin,
it is, but
undocumented workers, and like you said, like, they're surprised that they're getting anything at all, and like they're more afraid of being
taking
deported.
something from the government because they'll be documented
exactly,
and
right, deported as well, and obviously it's a safe space, and they have to kind of, they're more, that is their first sort of and most important issue that they have. So and then, like, again, like, as much as I liked seeing Michael Keaton and Tate Donovan in a movie together again, they were both in Clean and Sober when Tate Donovan was a kid. And there's a weird line later on in the movie where Donovan talks about, his character seeing Kenneth Feinberg
As a mentor.
as a mentor and having hair. And it was weird because I was thinking like, okay, well, in Clean and Sober, Tate Donovan was really like a teen in
That's funny.
this addiction drama, and Michael Keaton had hair, like wild, kind of like almost like a perm in that movie. But in terms of like that kind of like sleazy, over the top kind of villain lawyer, like he's not in it that much, but it's very much a caricature of what you would expect. But it does do an interesting sort of turn when it comes to politics in this movie. And I thought one of the scenes as well that actually works quite in a fascinating way is when you have Michael Keaton's character talking to the attorney general about taking the job, and that there is this sort of line between, okay, well, Keaton's character, Kenneth Feinberg in real life is a Democrat, and like this will the attorney general is conservative, obviously, because it's during the Bush administration.
It's like a win-win situation for him, and that's how he convinces
right
him to
but
give
the
him
way
the
that they
job.
talk to each other is very civil. It's not what you'd expect when the
From
cameras
today.
are rolling. But even when the cameras are rolling, because I think at the end of the day, most politicians are going to be sitting at the same table. Like they'll put on a show for you when they're talking to the public.
Are coming around.
Exactly. But when it comes to behind the scenes, they are very much mostly on the same side.
They all get it.
Yeah.
Right.
And not to get too political, but I am going to say this about Republicans and conservatives, where it truly does not work in a situation like this, because the whole sort of party line when it comes to conservatism is basically you run the country like a business. And that's the approach that even this fund is taking, to the point where the first time Feinberg talks to these families, he completely blunders it because he's not sympathetic in any way. He's impartial, and he's not a monster, but he's looking at it from the point of view of how the numbers add up. And it's to the point where you have Stanley Tucci in this great supporting role, who's basically
Charles Wolf.
Representing the people and their best interest, and what the people want more than anything else is just to be treated like a human being and not a statistic, or not a finite number.
And that's what the movie, I think, does a pretty good job of. Like, I don't think that there's anything necessarily spectacular in the movie, and I think it's fairly by the book, but I think it has some good performances. I think, like we said, with the writing, which is a little obvious and maybe on the nose, but I think for something like this, like a Netflix 9/11 movie that is sort of a prestige picture, but
it's also a dramatic procedural as well.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem like it's like, trying so hard to be like when I talked about, you said it's a little bit emotionally manipulative. I can take like a little bit, or when the writing is like obvious but still impactful, but it's not like fucking like, you better feel something, man. Like it Trial of the Chicago 7.
That's where I wanted to go, because I feel like these two films, they both have Michael Keaton as well.
Both Netflix. Like, it's just one movie I think is trying really fucking hard to like lay it home, where I feel like this is doing, it's obvious, and it's like, again, I think it's a nice reminder at 20 years later, and showcasing, we all knew about the 9/11 Victims Fund and things like that, but
even still going on, where you have like Jon Stewart representing, first responders, and the idea that even like, people were getting sick months after,
years later, decades later.
And that fund wouldn't cover them because, an illness just doesn't happen overnight, right? Like, people getting sick because of asbestos, or, breathing in smoke, or eczema and things like that.
So to me, it was interesting going through and getting to the minutia of, even if it didn't necessarily get into like the nitty gritty, like, stuff of it. It was pretty, I think, kind of surface level, focusing on the families and the emotional aspect, and saying, don't treat everyone just with a number of what on their life kind of thing, and having them go through and, seeing Feinberg's, like you said, starting as this kind of businessman that's like, we're going to get that 80%, everyone's going to get this number, this formula kind of thing, and not thinking about that, not every case is going to be exactly the same, but then how he kind of starts to understand these stories and try to work them all in, and ultimately get the right kind kind of decision on everything, I think was, they did a solid job. And I think it really helps having great actors like Michael Keaton and Stanley Tucci and Amy Ryan. And like, I think they kind of carry the movie. And I was never, I never rolled my eyes of being like, oh my God, this is so heavy handed or really, I just was like, okay, yeah, I feel like for the audience that you're making this movie for, I think they kind of nail the tone and kind of how, subtle they needed to be throughout the whole
Yeah.
thing of like, and it's not very subtle, but again, going back to Trial of the Chicago 7, like it's not, no one's hamming it up and no one's trying to give this like over the top kind of like,
It's not
Oscar-y.
speechified like in that way.
Yeah.
Like it's a little bit more, and again, I don't necessarily like using the word subtle, but I think Sara Colangelo is a much better director than Aaron Sorkin is in terms
Yeah.
of handling some of the emotional scenes. But where I do think it is emotionally manipulative at times is through the score and some of the kind of slick cinematography and the compositions. There's a lot of leading room in scenes where you have characters kind of standing in the corner of the frame, and then whether it be to the right or the left, there's a lot of sort of extra space there that I kind of felt a
Sure.
little bit annoying after a while. And then the score itself is the part that I do feel is the most kind of heavy-handed in terms of hitting home how you're supposed to feel in any one scene, where you don't need that because it is so emotionally raw to begin with that I think anybody that's watching this film, whether you are liberal or conservative or libertarian or in between or whatever, you're still going to be very much empathetic
You're going to
and
feel for the
sympathetic.
people.
Yeah, because it's about the people. It's not part of the story, and I think part of what doesn't make the film work completely is Michael Keaton's character. Classic storytelling tropes is that you have a character who starts at the beginning as somebody and then has this change by
This
the end.
epiphany. Yeah.
But Keaton, one, he's so likable, maybe that's part of it. But two, Kenneth Feinberg again isn't really a bad person. Like he's
No.
not Tate Donovan's character. Like if it was
Sure.
Tate Donovan's lawyer who was going through this,
He has good intentions from the beginning.
yeah, even though he admits that part of it is ego in terms of taking it pro bono and being the one to want to do this. But you never feel like he was a monster or like that classic like shark lawyer kind of type person. Like yes, he is more grounded by the end of it, and he comes to realize that like this truly is not about just numbers, and that it can't be just a simple kind of okay, well, I'll give you this much money and then move on. Like you have to kind of really assess the person and be there for them. And he talks about, lawyers can't be therapists, but in this situation, you have to kind of give the client as much opportunity to just tell their story or talk to them and just be there. And watching those moments, again, sometimes very emotionally manipulative, but a lot of the actors that are kind of in these smaller roles
They make
are
it effective.
exactly. And you have those moments where I think it does come together. Again, like you take some of the sort of subplots or some of the specific sort of cases where you have the widow
Yeah.
of a firefighter and sort of what she's going through and
And
why
what she
she
learns
does.
about her husband.
Yeah,
and,
and
things like that, yeah.
and why she doesn't want to sign the document. And then you have a gay man whose spouse was also trapped in one of the towers, but he's
Well,
not.
they weren't married yet.
No.
So then
Yeah, that's what I
legally-
mean, because he's not
Yeah.
recognized because they weren't legally married. So his parents get those benefits, and his parents don't recognize him. And so again,
He was estranged from his parents. Yeah.
yeah. And so those stories, again, on their own, are very powerful and emotional, but they also do get a little bit of a shortcut or a short thrift throughout the film, because again, they're basically serving Michael Keaton and Amy Ryan's characters in
And
terms
where
of
they're,
development.
yeah, exactly. No, I get that. And even the opening scene of the movie right away, I was like, oh no, because the shot in the classroom when he's giving the speech, which is essentially what the movie's going to be about, to his class and stuff like that.
Right. It literally spells out what the film is, especially with the
in those
title. It's
opening,
like,
yeah.
what's life worth? And
Yeah. So at first I was like, oh no. But then the movie, I think, settles in and ends up, again, I think 20 years later, something like this is important and very interesting with great actors, and I enjoyed it. I just, yeah, I'm kind of with you that I don't think it does anything exceptional, but it kind of just, hits every note how it kind of should, and then
And I think I'm gonna
ultimately,
like this movie more. I don't know how you feel, but I think I'm gonna like this movie more by the end of, like, say, next year, or in the winter, when it doesn't get any Oscar nominations or things like that, where, like, the Trial of the Chicago 7, which was also perfectly fine for the most part, but it being nominated for all these awards and keeping it in the conversation almost made it a terrible film, even more so than, like, not that it changed the movie, it's like I don't want to hear about this thing anymore.
right, where I feel like everyone will properly say this movie is good, not great, where they should have also said that about Trial of Chicago 7,
Yeah.
but everyone kept calling it great, and I couldn't see that. I was on the same page with you.
Yeah, and we should
Um,
also mention that Higher Ground is the production company that helped sort of make the deal with Netflix, and that's Barack Obama and Michelle Obama's
oh,
production
okay.
company, and they've done a lot of documentaries for them. So, um, and it is interesting that film, that Worth, did play at Sundance back in 2019. So they were
I thought it was
hold
2020.
oh 2020, the year before.
Hmm.
So they were holding it specifically for the 20th anniversary, which, again, maybe that is also something that is a little bit of a you have
Yeah,
some apprehensions towards.
of trying to capitalize
Yeah.
on it when it's especially like again, I think its intentions are in the right place, so I don't know if it's necessarily like, I don't think it's like a thriller or something like that that's trying to kind of capitalize on that. Like, I think its intentions are in the right spot. So putting it in a place where, more, not unfortunately, but like the 20th anniversary will put more attention on, the anniversary of 9/11,
Well, yeah,
and the
like, you
people we
go on
lost.
to
But like,
iTunes right now,
yeah,
there are tons of documentaries
everyone's
and
doing it. And I
yeah.
think, like, as long as your intentions are in the right spot, which I think for the most part, a lot of these things are, even though if it's still a business ultimately, and you want, people to watch the movie or subscribe to watch it. So it is a little bit of capitalizing on that anniversary. But um, I think the movie's heart is in the right place, and is trying to, it really does, I think, care about the people in this fund, and want to show how it came from, you know, just seeing them as like, okay, this very basic formula of what your worth is basically your job and how much money you make, to something more. And I think the movie does a pretty decent job at that. It's just, nothing blew me away, and I think it probably could have been better. But I think it perfectly hits that, yeah, that was a pretty good movie, like, kind of bar.
Yeah,
So
and again, to your point, like, I feel like, compared to something like Oliver Stone's World Trade Center, which came out in 2006, and
yes.
that was an interesting year in itself, because you also had Paul Greengrass's United 93,
Was
and
Ladder 49 also a 9/11 movie, or is
no,
it,
no, no,
no?
no, it wasn't.
No,
It was
no.
just a
Okay.
firefighter film.
Wasn't there a Nick Cage one, or is that
That
the
is
one I'm
World
talking
Trade
about?
Center, with
Okay,
the
that's
Oliver
what I'm
Stone
thinking of.
movie,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
then you
Okay,
also had Paul
I got
Greengrass.
that and Ladder 49 mixed up.
Yeah, so Paul Greengrass's United 93 and World Trade Center came out in the same year, and then you also had the A&E TV movie Flight 93. Two of those films are emotionally manipulative garbage, and they were, basically exploiting a horrible, horrible event,
And that's
where
what I kind of mean, where I don't think this movie's doing that.
yeah, where Paul Greengrass's United 93 is not necessarily a drama. It is more so a thriller, but it still was able to ride that line of being respectful, but also being engaging in terms of the like, suspense, even though you know what's going to happen. And it is, by the end, very tragic, and it is still respectful to those who lost their lives. Where United 93, where with World Trade
World
Center,
Trade
watching
Center,
it, you
yeah.
just kind of felt to yourself like, okay, like, this truly is,
Because it was a fictional story, just an amalgamation of, a bunch of different stories during nine
yeah,
11 right? And then they just kind of made this, again, and almost too soon after it, right? Like, I
yeah,
feel
this
like
weepy drama that, has Oliver Stone's kind of classic, guerrilla style filmmaking with the eccentricities of being hallucinatory. Like there's one scene that, you know, everybody talks about in World Trade Center where Michael Pena's character sees Jesus with a water bottle, and you're just like, you know, you
Mhm.
don't, that's not
I mean,
needed.
that's Oliver Stone.
Yeah, exactly, and he just can't help himself sometimes when it comes to that stuff. And it's even worse now when Oliver Stone talks about being sort of, he's not a conspiracy, well, he kind of is a little bit of a conspiracy theorist with JFK, but like, you know, his leanings towards sort of dictatorships and things like that, it's just like, it makes it even worse in
Ickier.
retrospective.
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think this movie does any of that, and I think it is respectful, and I'm okay with it coming out on the 20th anniversary just to get more, eyes on it. And yeah, I think it's it's a pretty decent, movie. So I'm gonna give it I'll give it a 3 out of 5.
I'll also give it a 3 out of 5.
Cool. Thank you all for listening. We really, really do appreciate it. As Eric mentioned, we're playing into TIFF right now. It's my favorite time of the year, and like I mentioned earlier, like I think it's important to kind of take a step back and remember this event. And I think this movie coming out, and I'm glad that I watched it right before, because we will be so busy over the next couple weeks.
Well,
But
even how it affected
um,
TIFF, right? Like, because
yeah.
the year that, you know, that it happened with 9/11, TIFF was canceled, and in the
Mhm.
years since then, you know, TIFF does have a kind of remembrance, especially when it comes to anniversary stuff, where like they talked about, um, you know, that was the year when Mulholland Drive and Donnie Darko were playing the festival, and how they had to
Mhm.
cancel it out of, you know, just not knowing what the
Just
world was going to
yeah,
be like.
exactly. You don't
So
want to have a big event during that time. But yeah, we'll have tons of coverage. The festival is happening this year. And like again, it's all eerie watching this stuff, because the last 2 years have had cancellations, different things, tons of people losing their lives. So it's just, I think this movie hit me a little harder because of all that stuff too. So keep it locked right here on YouTube or on podcast services on Untitled Movie Reviews. We'll have coverage of the entire Toronto International Film Festival. So we'll be doing capsule reviews, which means it's going to be a little bit shorter than the 40 minutes or so you're getting here. We're going to try to keep them to 10-15 minute reviews of everything we see during the festival this year. Like Eric mentioned, we'll try to sprinkle in some stuff that's coming out in cinemas like Card Counter and things like that, maybe during the festival, but it might come afterwards. And then we'll also have a big preview show of TIFF coming out this Monday, September the 4th, 5th, 6th is Monday, Labor Day. So we'll have a big TIFF preview with some impressions and stuff there. And then you'll see reviews start to trickle out next week. So yeah, we'll be super busy over the next couple weeks at TIFF. So we'll have tons of reviews right here on YouTube and podcast services. So please check those out. We'd really, really appreciate it. You can find kind of all the links to everything Untitled over on Letterboxd. Our HQ is Untitled_movies. We're basically the same on all social medias, so go check us out all there. Everything you need, YouTube reviews, ratings, which will have links to the podcast and the YouTube versions. Everything's over on Letterboxd, so that's the easiest place to send you guys. Thank you so much who's followed recently. We're almost at 600 followers over on Letterboxd, which is awesome, for just starting that a little while ago. So really, really appreciate that. And as always, my name is Matt Rorabeck. You can find more of my work around the internet, but mostly at untitledmoviepodcast.com. And you can follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rorabeck.
And I'm Eric Marchen. You can find more of my video reviews at rogerstv.com/cinemascene and on the social medias at EM6211.
Until next time.
Never forget,